So you got half a class, so you get the other half today, plus some. And just to get you started, I wanted to ask you this question. How important is money to you? It's very, if you don't have it, that's exactly right, because it's extremely important when that happens. It's important when you need it. If you really need money, it becomes a very high priority and grind on you. There are a lot of people, they don't ever think about that question. I don't know if we think about that question either. So to do this, I wanted to give you a little chance to reflect on something. And we're going to give you 10 questions to help you understand how important money is. I'm not asking for your answers. I'm not asking for you to expose your soul. I'm not asking for anything that's going to be upsetting or embarrassing. This is for you, not for me. And so there's this scale, and I'm not going to have you keep track of it unless you want to do it mentally. But one means that is the farthest thing from your mind. It would never describe you ever at all. So don't even ask me that question. But on the other side of the 5, you have you've been reading my mail, haven't you? When I look in the mirror, that's what I see. That's what a 5 is. I take those 1 to 5 scales. They don't mean anything. So I feel like I have to explain it a little bit. So here are the 10 questions. I'll pause if just quietly think about this. I often worry about having enough money. Think about that for a moment. Number 2, I admire people who are financially successful. Number 3, I feel more secure when my bank account is growing. That's an interesting question by itself. I didn't ask the second part, which is, are you less secure when it's sinking? But it's inferred. I would feel embarrassed if others knew I was struggling financially. Number 5, halfway through, I believe having more money would solve most of my problems. And then number 6, I sometimes compare myself to others based upon what they own. In other words, if they have a nice car, I'm always evaluating whether or not I'm at their level or not. It's called keeping up with the Joneses. Number 7, I hesitate to give generously because I might need the money later. I feel more valuable when I can afford things others can't. Number 9, I spend time imagining what I'd do if I had a lot of money. If you won the lottery, do you dream about what you'd do if you won the lottery? I believe that money is one of the keys to happiness. Notice how the phrasing is there. Now, I'm not going to ask you how you did, because like I said, that's personal, but I will ask you to think about these things. You don't have to answer these either, but what question felt most challenging for you to answer? Which one made you cringe just a hair when you saw it? Because it's a little bit like you. And the other thing we're going to look at today, which is, does your attitude toward money align with what Jesus teaches in Luke? See, sometimes we say, I believe this, but if you don't feel the same way, if your perceptions are not the same as that of Jesus, then how can you say you're following Jesus? That's an interesting idea that we probably don't confront often enough. But then, next question, this you can answer. What can money not buy? What's that? Friends, okay. Can't buy friends. Yeah. What's that? Another week of life, okay? What's that? Okay, can't buy yourself, can't buy happiness. That's right. Can't buy health. Okay. Now it's interesting. We ask this question, and we don't ask this question, but let me give you some of the things that we hear, at least. What's that? You can't buy friends. You listen to this. You can buy medicine, but you cannot buy health. You can buy a good mattress, but you cannot buy a good night's sleep. You can buy food, but you cannot buy an appetite. You can buy companionship, but you cannot buy friendship. Now, let me explain that. My wife, for years, worked in an elementary school, and they had what was called in the spring, when I grew up, it was called field day, but they called it buddy fun day. And so you would find a friend and you would do all these events with your buddy. And she came home and told me a story one time. She had this kid come in, he had a handful of money, and he says, I don't really have a pal, so can I buy one? Now, that speaks volumes. But I also know there are a lot of adults exactly in that situation. And so you can buy companionship, but you can't buy a friend. You can buy a better house, but you cannot buy a home. And you can buy a better life, but you can't buy eternal life. All the things that money cannot buy. And as the great philosopher Brooks sang, you aren't wealthy until you have something that money can't buy. That's an important idea that Jesus is going to bring up. So as we delve into this lesson, I wanted you to see this and see if what you think about it. There's a successful man in North Dallas, and he ran a booming real estate and tech investment firm. And that year, the market just exploded, and his portfolio doubled and then tripled. The rental properties, the crypto, the high yield stocks, they all went up. He sat in his Highland Park home, scrolling through the numbers on his iPhone, and thought, what am I going to do with this gain? My accounts are really kind of maxed out. They're not going to do much better than this. I need to move my wealth somewhere bigger. So he had an idea. He said, here's what I think I'll do. I'll sell some of my properties. I'll restructure some of my investments, and I'll open more tax shelters, and I can put it in the long-term secure holdings. And maybe I can even start a private foundation in my name. And then you can say, I've made it. I've got more than enough for the rest of my life. It's time to enjoy, travel the world, buy that lake house, relax. You've earned this. Now, 2 questions. First question is this realistic? Are there people like that? There must be people like that. You read in the papers all the time, there are people like this, don't you? When there was papers, I guess I have to put that in. And now, secondly, does this make good financial sense? If you want to make more, it depends on what your goals are. That's why every financial advisor asks you, what are your goals? And you go, I don't, more money. I don't know what it is. So, Eric. Okay. It is, because the next one is part of the story is, and God comes, says, you fool, tonight your life is going to end. Who's going to enjoy all of that wealth for yourself? The question is, see, that changes the story, by the way. If you go back to this, that changes the story. It makes perfect financial sense, but it doesn't make any spiritual sense. Sometimes the things that make financial sense don't make spiritual sense. And so you have to ask the question, what do I want to look like? And which brings us to the question of the day. How do my perceptions match those of Jesus, or do they match? The hard thing for us, because we tend to, for lack of a better way of saying it, we put secular over here, sacred over here, and there's a gulf in between. And we deal with our secular Monday through Saturday. We deal with our sacred on Sunday, and we don't mix and mingle them. That's American society, by the way. And if you can dispute that, but I think I could prove it 7 ways to Sunday. But last week we covered 2 things. These are stories that are found only in the book of Luke. They're not found in any other gospels. The only source we have of them is Luke himself. So he's telling these stories. One is of the rich fool. That's the story updated story we just read. And then there is the rich man and Lazarus. The story of the rich man and the poor beggar named Lazarus. And when they both die, one goes to condemnation, the other goes into Abraham's bosom, and they cannot meet. Why? Because there has been a chasm in eternity, but I suggest there's a chasm in life as well between those two. And so Jesus teaches something out of that. However, the other part is a couple of questions to see if I can figure out if you learned anything. What's the problem with money in the story of the rich fool? What's that? Okay, he lives to make more. Okay. Everything is about me. In fact, we didn't do this, but there are 26 times the first person pronoun is used in that story. Yeah. It's more important to him than God. Okay. Interesting. We look at that and we go, of course. I made it myself. I always liked what happened in the movie Shenandoah, where Jimmy Stewart plays a crotchety old farmer in Virginia who's trying to escape the Civil War. He doesn't like either side and just wants to be left alone. Problem was his sons get drawn into the war. One gets shot and is wounded. He has a daughter who has been captured. And at the end of the war, it all comes out right. But the problem was, before that time, he sat down at the dinner table. And his prayer went something like this: Lord, we found this land, we bought this land, we cleared this land, we platted this land, we plowed this land, we weeded this land, and we harvested this land. We've done it all by ourselves, but thanks anyhow. I like that because it's too real. That's not our regular prayer, but maybe that's what some people think. Harry?
Yeah. Will he that layeth up?
That's a critical idea that we're going to have to look at. So how does it affect your spirit? How does money affect your spiritual life? Okay, you can't take it with you when you go. The same hearse. My previous church, the church building right next to the funeral home. The funeral director was a good friend of mine, and his son was a good friend of us, and his kids went to school with us, so we've known them forever. And but I remember watching hearses. Yeah, outside of your office window, that's what you get to look at. By the way, it's a great perspective for a preacher to be able to look at hearses as they leave. Really good idea. But some of the poorest people in town left in the same hearse as the person that owned the most in town. Same hearse. It's no different. And so you forget, this not going to last you, does it? Anything else? How does money affect your spiritual life? That's a question we want to answer today. Now, in Luke 16, I have to tell you, in Luke 16, what we saw in Lazarus and the rich man is the second story here. The first one, we waited till this week to do. They're reversed in my mind because we never read this. We don't like this story, by the way. We like the next one. We don't like this one. And Luke, when he writes, sometimes we believe that Luke and other gospel writers write like, oh, here's a story. Let's tell that one. Oh, that reminds me, there's another one here. Oh, that reminds me, there's another one here. I'm not sure that's as accurate as we want to make it. I think there's a plan in which he's trying to get to cross a point. And so he has these serial ideas that come along that all draw the same idea. At the beginning of Luke chapter 16, there is a story about a steward who is required to give account for his actions because apparently he is embezzling from his boss. So the boss says, come and give an account. And he says, because you can't be my manager any longer. You bring me the books because you're fired. Gives him just a wee little bit of time. And so what he does, he starts thinking, now, I can't beg. I'm too proud to beg, and I'm too weak to dig. So I got to find another way. I got to find a way to survive until I can find my next scam. You want to update that. And so what he does, he goes to all these debtors and he says, how much do you owe? He says, I owe, it says here that it says I owe 900 gallons of olive oil. And the manager said, okay, let's take the ledger and let's rub that out and say, yeah, now you only owe for 450. He cut his bill in half. He goes down to another one. He says, how much do you owe? He says 1,000 bushels of wheat. He says, let's rub that out and make it 800. And it says that the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own than the people of light. Now, a couple of questions. Is the steward dishonest? He's a spades. Okay. Okay. Do you want a guy like that working for you? That's right. Now he's building favoritism. Now, it's interesting that this is real. You've never figured this out. You know what the biggest problem in retail is? Employees taking it out the back door. When I was in graduate school, I worked at Sears Roebuck selling shoes. You don't make a lot of money selling shoes. There's no graft in shoes, let me tell you. I couldn't say, let me see, these $12 pair of shoes, let's make it 10. That's not enough money to mess with. But that's called soft lines, and Sears had hard lines. Now, they sold tractors, and they sold lawnmowers, and they sold fencing, and they sold all this stuff. That's where the money was. And I remember one day, the manager left. And the talk was, and we figured it out, was we had a salesman who sold fencing. And in Abilene, Texas, fencing was a big deal for farmers, ranchers, whatever. But what he would do, he would sell fencing at reduced prices and then put down on the books that this is how much it was. And then he'd split the profits he was making with the manager to look the other way. And I was all of 21 years old, maybe at that time. I'd never heard anything like that. I realized that's the way of the world. He's dishonest. Everybody gets fired for being dishonest. This man's going to be fired for being dishonest. What makes this action so surprising? Okay, he's just blatant about it. Okay. Oh, he gets this commendation. And is he concerned about himself or about the person he's working for? Okay. Do you know anybody in business today that's more concerned about themselves and the people, the company they're working for? Yeah. What's in it for me is the big idea. But what do you think about this steward? Would you want him for your financial advice? He's smart. And you think about it, this would get this guy on the cover of Forbes magazine. He'd be right up there with Elon Musk as a financial genius. If you've never seen this in action, during the 80s especially, there was this thing going around churches. It's called church bonds. Because interest rates were through the roof, you couldn't borrow money without a lot of collateral. And so churches that needed to build, they would sometimes get their members to buy bonds to pay for the church building on the basis they would get a return in investment. My problem is I had a relative in that business, so I know this quite well. And we had a guy come to the church I was serving, and he started talking, and I began to realize that what he was saying about church bonds was that if you buy this bond and hold it, we'll pay you 7%. Now, you could have gotten a lot better rate somewhere else, but then the selling point was, think about how well you're serving the Lord with this money. I thought, no, it's not. And the problem was, the salesman and the company was taking about half of those fees, and they were making themselves wealthy to the point that some of them went to federal prison because they helped churches. They said, why are we guilty? We've just been trying to help poor churches grow. I thought, no, you weren't. You had the big house on the other side of town.
I knew you.
You know, of course, when I see this, I see Billy Saul Estes. You remember Billy Saul Estes? He did. Billy Saul Estes was a member of the Churches of Christ. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. Goes to federal prison for fraud because he's selling something, oil tanks in West Texas that don't exist. But I remember one time, the last time I saw Billy Saul Estes, I was surprised to see him because he was at a lecture at the ACU lectureships where a guy named Floyd Rose was speaking. Floyd was one of Marshall Keeble's last surviving original boys. He taught preach. And I remember Billy Saul got up and he led the prayer. Now, I was problematic myself. And so he gets up, but he makes a speech that when I was in my worst situation, falsely accused, only people who cared for me were my black brethren. I thought, if they only knew more about you, they wouldn't have done that. Here it is, right here in print. And so Jesus goes on and he says, I tell you, use worldly wealth for yourselves so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed in eternal dwellings. Now, in a sense, the master in the story is either God or Jesus commending the steward. Why does Jesus seem to commend the steward's actions? Does it not bother you? The steward's commended. We don't like this story. He made friends to do something else. Now, we don't like this story. We wish Luke would have left it out. We wish he'd have run out of ink about here and said, oh man, I forgot that. That's not important anyway. It's only one to happen. That's not what happened. So he talks about this, but how can you use wealth for eternal purposes? Because that's what he says is use your worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself so that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings. He's talking about eternal stuff. How do you use your money here for eternity? How's that work? Okay. 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 Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Think about the next story. The next story is the one we already looked at, which is the rich man and Lazarus. Had the rich man done something for Lazarus, he would have been in a different place in eternity. But he ignored the situation. And therefore, he used his worldly wealth for himself and not to help other people. That's a simplistic way, I guess, to put it, but I think it's the best way. What does it mean to use it for eternal purpose? How do you use money for eternal purpose? Okay. Yeah. We're going to we're going to deal with Samaritans. He tells that story about the Good Samaritan. When we get there, he talks about the one who is not religious doing the most spiritual thing. Interesting idea. Why the end of that parable, at the end of that story, as Jesus explains, he said, for someone, you cannot serve both God and money. Why is it impossible to do that? How do you know that though? The goals are different. What's the goal of having money? Having more money. Okay. Usually that's what they tell you is here's your return on investment. That's the big idea. For personal security, that's one of the ideas. What about the other? Go ahead. Okay. The concept of saying I'll manipulate the process to where if I give enough money, that entitles me to this. Now, that's, by the way, you got to be really careful if you ever talk about money in the church, because that's how it sometimes comes out. If you'll give more money, see, that's the health and wealth gospel, right? That's right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is a spiritual Ponzi scheme. In other words, I'll serve money for a while and then give some of it to God, but I'll go back to money and you never know where you stand. Yeah, exactly. They at least maintain, yeah. Barry? Okay. Think you were going to say something. Okay. Yeah. There is that requirement that somewhere, the greater the blessing, the more responsibility. Money tends to give you a sense of control. Uh, After all, if a unexpected bill comes in, you got the money. If I want to go on a vacation, I got the money. I have a measure of control. Now I'm going to move on, unless I have a third class on this. This is where we get to the rich ruler. Now I'm not sure if we got young in this, but we've always added young to it. But there's this guy, he's a certain ruler. We infer that he's rich from the story because it says he has great wealth. And so he comes to Jesus, what good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, do you think the man is sincere when he asks that question? Okay. He traveled a distance to ask the question. Okay. Was he sincere? Or was he wanting Jesus to pat him on the head and says, good boy? What do you think he thought had to be done? Okay. But what more? I mean, if he had already done those things, what's he looking for? By the way, this is, go ahead. Okay. We're looking for, by the way, we're all looking for the same thing this guy is. We're looking for a spiritual life hack. Tell me the one secret that if I do it right, I don't have to worry about this anymore. Let me ask you this question. He says, Jesus responds to him, he responds with the last six of the Ten Commandments. He says, these are the things you should have done. And he says, all these I've kept since I was a boy. If he's doing pretty well, we would say this is a really good guy. If he's doing pretty well, what does he need? Why is he bothered?
Is that you all say it? Am I doing enough? Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is this let me put it this way. Are we trying to be spiritual perfectionists? If I could only reach this level, I could only do this a little bit better. If I could tell me where I need to finally get to where things are good. And here's a guy, I think he's probably gone through all the right things. The problem, what he's doing is religion does not satisfy. It never has, never will. Doing the right things will never satisfy. It'll wear you out, but it won't satisfy. Uh-huh. It is. There's something gnawing. He's gnawing on him. Now, Jesus says, you still lack one thing, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. Do we follow that command today, or do we ignore it? I've never had somebody come down front and they want to be baptized, and I say, can you show me your checkbook? Write me a check for, make it out to CASH. That stands for Jesus. And then we're going to baptize you. You'll be great, but you'll be empty, but you'll be great.
It's saying, we'll have to allow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Doubts are okay. Believing is what it's all about. Now, is Jesus saying we all have to give away wealth? What's he saying then? Okay. And it says the young man, when he heard this, he was very sad because he was also very wealthy. I like the word very there in both places. He was very wealthy and he was very sad. What makes wealth a spiritual obstacle for many? Trust. In what way? Okay. You rely on more than that. Yeah. Okay. Even Paul said, if I give away everything I have, give my body be burned and have not love, I am nothing left. And so the spiritual obstacle is there. And then Jesus goes on and says how hard it is for the rich in the kingdom of heaven. In fact, it's easier to go through, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. When Luke writes this story, the word for needle is a particular word which means surgical needle. It's not metaphorical. I've known people say, it's like a camel going through a small gate. It's hard. No, he's saying this is a hyperbole. Just think about the picture in your mind. Big old camel going through this thing I can't even see anymore. That's what the problem is. And he says it's hard for them. And it's a word that we get scoliosis from, which means that is twisted or torqued. That is the path that you have to take is so hard that you don't know what to do about it. And so the barrier's there. Now I've got 5 minutes, but I'm going to ask this question. Are people excluded from the kingdom of God because they are rich? Okay, Job wasn't. Abraham was. See, that's not the problem. Now here's the second part of that question. Are people in the kingdom because they are poor? Okay. Okay. Rich and poor, by the way, are earthly terms. They're earthly ideas. They have nothing. God doesn't measure either one. The only thing that he measures, what Matthew would say, he said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Meaning, are you humble enough to realize that you're not in control of life? That's a different story. Now, the truth be told that you can never be free as long as you're holding what holds you. There was a story that of researchers who wondered if a monkey would be smart enough to do something. And that is, they built this cage to where the slats were enough to where you could put your hand in like this, but you couldn't get it out if you did this. And then they put a nut on the inside, and they would put these out in the jungle, and monkeys would come and they'd reach in and they'd get the nut, and then they started trying to get it out, and they couldn't get it out. And all they had to do is let it go. But many of them starved themselves to death holding that nut in their hand without letting it go to save themselves. A lot of people like that. You can never be free as long as you are holding what holds you. And so wealth deceives us about our spiritual health. And I always like what Paul says. He says the deceitfulness of wealth, or Jesus says wealth is deceitful. The deceitfulness of wealth is what he says in Mark chapter 4 and verse 19 when he talks about the parable of the sower. This is trying to sell you something that is not true. And in a sense, you can find out what the deception is. This is kind of what we've been saying. the assumption that money is a spiritual blessing. So the more money you have, the more blessed you are. Now that can be true. It may not be true. The more money you have, the more cursed you may be. I've known too many people like that. And so it's not just a measure of whether you're spiritually healthy or not. There's this illusionment of happiness and contentment, that if I have enough money, I will be content, but you'll never be content. I remember in the 1990s, after banks failed, there was this financial product called junk bonds. And the big marketer for junk bonds, the inventor of the instrument, I don't understand junk bonds. Anything with the word junk in it, I don't want. But somehow that became a very favorite thing. And Michael Milliken was the guy that sold America on junk bonds. He made billions of dollars on the cover of Time magazine. He was the golden boy of the finance situation right up until he went to federal prison. And so CBS News takes their 60 Minutes program in to interview Michael Milliken in prison. They're sitting across from it. And the interviewer says, you had billions of dollars. All you had to do was stop. Why did you keep doing this? And Milliken said, it's not about the money. It's about keeping score. See, there's the problem. I'm keeping score. How do I rate among others? And that you'll never be happy and content when that happens. Wealth doesn't satisfy because it can't. You always want more. And we're going to measure ourselves against others with wealth. We are better than. In fact, we gain in our society our standing. Emotional standing is based upon how we see ourselves in comparison to other people. And so that's the way it's going to be. Now, what does Jesus teach about more is the big problem. And three things, just as we quickly try to end. Money is a tool to do good. That's why God gives us money, by the way. So use it to do that. It's okay to do things for yourself, but it's also better to say, how can I live my life in a way that I can help as many people as possible? That doesn't mean giving away money to people who cannot help it. I've worked benevolence. Handing people $100 bill does not improve their situation. I know that. Secondly, money can nudge your faith from you. It doesn't push it. It just nudges just a little at a time. So be careful about how you're feeling about it, what you're saying about it. And then the last thing is decide what enough is. It's enough for you. At what point is it enough? Now, that's a hard thing to determine, but everybody has a level somewhere that's enough, because you can never have enough of what you don't really need. You don't need it. You'll keep pursuing it. You'll never get enough of it. As Paul would say in 1 Timothy chapter 6, if we have food and shelter, we have enough, because you came naked into this world, you'll leave naked going out of it. As I have seen too many times, where the rich man has a blood-covered sheet over him as they wheel him out to the funeral home. Next week, we're going to talk about prayer. We're going to lighten it back to a different subject. So about prayer next week,